Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be discussing a question from the November 2020 variant 23. Okay. So the question says that changes in tobacco production and consumption have both microeconomic and macroeconomic impacts. Tobacco plants are grown in at least 124 countries with different levels of development. A higher proportion of the poor than the rich consume tobacco products, and the market for cigarettes producing that is produ- the market for cigarettes produced using tobacco is changing. The demand for cigarettes and some other demanded goods is declining as well in a number of countries. Now, the first question says define microeconomics. Relatively simple. You just need to give the definition. Remember that definition should not exceed more than two lines. You don't need to write a lot in a definition. You just need to define it. That's it. Only two lines is more than enough. So you could talk about microeconomics is a study which is concerned, which basically focuses on individuals. It focuses on individuals, individual households, individual producers, that is individual markets. Um, you know, for example, market for cars, demand for cars. It focuses on when you say that it focuses on markets, we're talking about demand and supply, right? So demand and supply of cars, or demand and supply of bicycles, or demand and supply of good A, or demand and supply of good B, right? So that's what it focuses on individual firms and separate markets. So that's what microeconomics is focusing about. It takes a micro vision in individual, it's in the economic. So it takes a micro vision on the economic agents individually, like individual markets, individual producers, individual consumers of a particular market, not only about producers but consumers of a particular market as well, and their behavior, how they respond. So, moving to part B of the question, which says, explain two causes of differences in economic development between countries. Now, before I move on to this question, before I start or jump onto the answer to this question, you guys need to understand what economic development means. Now, there's a difference between economic growth and development. Although a lot of people do confuse both terms, but they are different. Economic growth basically is concerned about a rise in real GDP. It's concerned about a rise in output, right? And while economic development, guys, is basically a welfare concept. It's concerned about your living standards and your economic welfare. So, does economic growth result into economic development? Yes and no, both. It depends on a lot of factors, but economic development is a large term, and it's a big umbrella term. It consists of living standards and welfare. What is the education like in a country? What are the health standards in a country? What is the poverty rate? What's the crime rate? What's the literacy rate? How much freedom of liberty? How much freedom of speech do you have? What is the law and order or the crime in the city? Obviously, the more the economic growth, the higher would be the development, considering that you do not have any negative externalities, and there is not no environmental pollution, or you could say that um, that economic growth is not accompanied by undesirable inflationary pressures. So yes, in that sense, economic development will be there, but not all economic growth is does leads to economic development. So economic development is when you're focusing on the welfare of a society, right? The economic welfare of a society. So it's a welfare concept. Remember that. So the question says two causes of differences in economic development between countries, and I'm going to be giving you more than two causes because obviously you guys know, my audience knows that the purpose of these past paper solutions is not to just give you the answer, but to provide a more comprehensive view and in-depth knowledge so that it may enhance your knowledge set in economics. So two causes of differences in economic development between countries could be that. Now, for a 4 mark question, you don't need to define what economic development is. So a lot of students might first define what economic development is. That is not required. So for 4 marks, we'll start directly by saying that the causes or the differences in economic development between countries are as follows. So you could talk about that some countries obviously have more economic development, while some countries have low levels of economic development, and the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations are severely working towards promoting economic development of poor countries and developing countries like Pakistan, like Africa, right? So these countries are poor countries basically, and economic development in poor countries are low, right? We have quite a low level of economic development in Pakistan and African countries, sub-Sahara African countries especially. So the reasons why economic development might be lacking in such economies is because of low levels of income. So income levels are low. You could talk about income per capita. Income per capita is low in these countries. That is why there's a significant difference between economic development in developing economies versus economic development in developed economies. You could talk about countries that are developing versus countries that are developed. That is that is developing countries, like you talk about poor economies, while developed countries like rich economies such as the US, the United Kingdom, right? These are Germany. These are rich economies. So like China. So first you could talk about income levels. GDP per capita is also income per capita is also known as GDP per capita. These are obviously because of these differences. The GDP per capita is higher in developed economies. That is why they are more richer. And GDP per capita is basically measuring your average incomes. Remember that, how much on an average a person earns in a given year, right? So basically, also you could talk about that. In developing economies, yeah, you have more. There's more international transactions taking place in developed economies, especially as compared to developing. So we could talk about that. Developed economies export a lot to other countries, and developed economies even export to the developing economies. A lot of developing economies are reliant on rich source of raw materials from these developed economies. So exports are more in developing economies versus developed economies versus exports in developing countries, right? You could talk about that. The reason why and since your exports will be higher in developed countries, definitely that would result in more incomes, that would result in more living standards, more tax revenues to the government of these developed rich countries, which they can spend back on the economy on providing essential public services and all, and spending on infrastructure, education, healthcare. So also you could talk about that. The reasons why low levels of economic development exist in certain countries, and that is the reason why they are poor and developing, is because they are heavily reliant on the primary sector. Now, primary sector output is, I mean, just heavily relying on primary sector output and over specializing in primary sector would definitely result, although you will generate revenues from primary sector output, but over reliance on it might hamper or might result into low levels of economic growth later on in the future, because as demand goes down, maybe there might be a structural shift, and as demand for primary sector goes down later on, because globalization has resulted into the structure of the global demand for different industries changing. And if that happens, then definitely, as demand for primary sector output goes down, then in that sense, I mean, these economies that are severely dependent on primary sector output, both domestically, so they might suffer in that sense, right? So we know that poor countries are primarily dependent on rich, heavily dependent on primary sector output, and that is what results into low levels of economic development, because because the growth opportunities, or the growth in or the expansion is limited in primary sector industries, because obviously, because the value of the primary sector output is less, because obviously, the value of an output that is determined in a given industry is dependent upon what sort of raw material is using, what sort of labor is required, how much value addition is there. Obviously, the value addition that would take place in a tertiary sector industry or a manufacturing sector industry would be more than, in a primary sector industry that is concerned with fishing and mining and farming, right? So, and that is what determines the worth of the industry. That is what determines the value of the output generated from the industry. So the value of the output generated from that industry would be much lower, from the primary sector would be much lower than what is generated, or the GDP generated from the tertiary sector. And that is why primary sector just hires unskilled workers, and they are usually low paid jobs, right, as compared to high paid jobs in the tertiary sector. You could talk about that, there are low levels of economic development because the level of investments in is low in some countries, and they lack capital to invest, while compared to some economies that are running on huge availability of finances and huge levels of saving and capital to invest in, the governments have huge amount of money to invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare, while the private sector is also rich in finances, and they have the capability to obtain large sources of finances internationally as well, since those economies are well connected with international organizations, right? So in that sense, you could say that the level of economic development is much higher in developed economies versus in poor economies, because investment is a main source of economic growth. It's a huge driver of economic growth. Remember that the more the investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare, the more the investment in expansion of businesses and capital goods, the more would be the long run economic growth, which would also manifest into higher levels of economic development later on in the future. And if countries are struggling with investing huge sums of money into projects like into growth projects, into industries like power generation, into industries like and into huge industries, investing in huge industries that contribute significantly to the growth of an economy. If countries are struggling with that amount of investments because of various reasons, maybe because of lack of finances, then definitely economic growth will be low, and definitely economic level of economic development will be low as well. Right. You could also talk about that countries struggle with differences in economic development because of the level of education and the level of literacy rates. Right. The level of education and the literacy rates is also, which is very important, because education and literacy is quite connected with the fact that it's quite connected with the fact that higher education, high levels of literacy rate would mean high levels of HDI, that is Human Development Index. And a high level of Human Development Index is one of the indicators for measuring not only economic development but living standards as well. So a higher HDI indicates higher levels of economic development. So, if the education and literacy rate will be higher, then the your labor force would be more productive, they would be more skilled, and the value of the output generated by that labor would be definitely be much higher than countries which struggle with low levels of education and literacy rate. And the higher the value of an output, the higher the GDP of that country, right? And if that in that sense, definitely higher would be the living standards and the incomes earned by the workers, producing that output, obviously. And also remember that education and literacy rates have a direct, so education and literacy rate is considered a merit good, because it does not only impacts, it also impacts others around you, the third party, the people around you. And the more educated your society is, it has a direct impact on your health, the way you carry yourself, the lifestyle you have. And that determines economic development as a nation, definitely. So these points are quite well connected. Maybe countries suffer from a low levels of economic development because maybe the healthcare sector is quite poor in that country. Maybe you don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough healthcare professionals, you don't have enough hospitals in that economy, you don't have good treatment available, you don't have the technology available to treat diseases, you don't have the right vaccinations available. Maybe you're importing a lot of vaccinations. So obviously, I mean, in that sense, if you're importing even primary vaccinations or primary medicines, which any economy should be able to produce, then you will never be able to cater a large level of audience, or the economy, and you will not be able to cure essential diseases, and it would result into major outbreaks of diseases that shouldn't be there, such as maybe the outbreak of polio or the outbreak of other diseases, right? And that would definitely have an impact on your labor force in the economy in the future. It would also have an impact on economic growth in the future, long run economic growth. It will directly determine the amount of labor force that you will have, because it will just increase the death rate in an economy, right? And it would impact your overall living standards as well, because it would impact your quality of life, basically, right? And you could also talk about some countries lack in economic development, maybe because naturally, for maybe they lack natural resources. Maybe some countries are quite rich in natural resources that makes them capable. Maybe their geographical or climate is such that makes them capable of producing a lot more than other countries. Or maybe some countries lack in resources such as enterprise. Maybe they lack in resources such as such as labor and capital. Like there are, so some countries are sitting on huge levels of resources and factors of production, such as the enterprise. For example, the enterprise in the USA is quite significant as compared to the enterprise, let's say, in any other developing country. For example, you could give the example of Silicon Valley, right? So, and that directly has an impact on the productive capacity or the potential of an economy, the amount, the available, I mean, the quality and the quantity of resources that any country would have would directly have an impact on the productive capacity or the productive potential of any economy, right? So these are the various or the different reasons that you could mention. Although you are supposed to mention two reasons, but this question has in the past come as a 6 marker in case studies as well. This question could come as an 8 marker in your discuss question as well, connected to economic growth. So you must know these factors that determine the level of economic development. It's a good question to answer. Okay, guys. Now coming to part C of the question, which says that analyze how a cut in interest rates could basically reduce poverty. Now, this is a good question, but first we need to know what poverty is. Poverty is basically for two types. You can define this. If you even if you don't define this in the exam, that's fine. But if you do, then that's good. So poverty is of two types, which is absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is basically the inability to afford even the basic necessities, while your relative poverty is when certain people in the economy are poor relative to others, which simply means that. And how do we measure that on a scale? Basically, it's a normative assessment, and it's when it's when some people in the economy are earning less than the average income or the median income that is required to maintain an average living standard in society, right? So when some people are earning less than the average income or the median income that is required, or the median threshold income that is required to maintain an average incomes or an average living standard in society, basically when some people are earning less than even that, then which means that they are relatively poor. So all those people who are earning less than the median income required to maintain an average living standard, then it means that there is relative poverty. And if the size of such people is more, then it means that relative poverty would be higher. Also, relative poverty indicates a disparity between the rich and the poor. It represents an income gap. It represents income inequality in society, right? So the question says analyze how a cut in interest rates. And now cut in interest rates, remember, is basically a monetary policy. So when you reduce, and monetary policy, we know that governments use monetary policy and fiscal policy to achieve its different macroeconomic aims. And one of the macroeconomic aims of the government is to reduce poverty and improve living standards in society. And that is why the government is cutting down the interest rates so that it could improve poverty. And the question is asking you, how will it do that? Remember that you need to, for questions like these, you need to make sure that you analyze properly. You don't need to you don't only state what you're saying, you also need to analyze. The chain of analysis has to be very clear, because otherwise you will not get marks for what you're writing, guys. Okay, so make sure that whatever you're writing, the chain of analysis is to the point. So the question, so when you cut interest rates, what's going to happen is that you will say that interest rates are basically representing a cost of borrowing for people in society, for people in the economy. So the cost of borrowing would go down. And when the cost of borrowing goes down, what will happen is that people will borrow more and save less, because now the rate of return on saving is less. The reward on saving, which was the interest rate that they were earning on deposits, is now going down. So they will borrow more. So the opportunity cost of borrowing is less, while the opportunity cost of saving is more. So people could do more by borrowing and spending than they would sort of the reward they would get on what they save, is because that has gone down, basically. So the cost of borrowing goes down, the rate of return on saving goes down, and the cost of borrowing goes down as well. So people will borrow more. The poor or the rich both will borrow more. Households will borrow more. Firms will borrow more. So borrowing in the economy would go up. Borrowing by households, borrowing by consumers and households, borrowing by the firms, it would go up, right? And household borrowing and firms borrowing would go up, and they would definitely spend more. So investments would go up in that sense, consumer spending would go up in that sense. And investment in consumer spending is a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand would go up. And we know that when aggregate demand goes up, you could draw a demand and supply AD and AS diagram for that. And when aggregate demand goes up, it would shift to the right, since what happens is that consumer CNI is a component of AD, and as a result of that, your real GDP goes up from Y1 to Y2, and this is a sign of actual growth. Actual growth is when you utilize your existing resources to produce more output, and your real GDP goes up, and the actual growth is basically economic growth. So you see that a boost in consumption and a boost in investment is basically stimulating growth, and that is resulting into your real GDP to go up. And and basically what's going to happen is that how will that reduce poverty? It will reduce poverty because what's going to happen is that when AD will go up, then definitely the spending is more in the economy. So firms need to respond to that spending, and they respond to that because they need to produce output now. Because when people are spending, so firms need output as well. There should be output that is backed or matched by the level of spending in the economy, and firms would start producing more then, but they need labor for that to produce more. So as a result of that, firms will start hiring more labor, and we will see when they hire more workers, and they use their resources to, firms use their resources and they hire more workers to produce more output. That causes a movement along the aggregate supply curve, which causes an increase in real GDP. And because of that, and because of the fact that so the demand for labor goes up because firms are hiring more workers, because demand is for labor is derived demand. It is linked with the demand for goods and services. So as AD is rising, the demand for goods and services is rising, and that's causing the labor demand to go up basically. And when that happens, then your employment levels would go up in the economy, your unemployment levels would go down, and employment levels would go up. And as a result, when your real GDP goes up, your national income goes up, and people earn more incomes because now they have more jobs. They're no more unemployed anymore. They have more incomes in their hands. They spend more. Firms' profits would also, because when consumers spend, firms' incomes rise as well, and they hire more workers. So there's a more spillover effect in the economy when consumer spending drives firm spending, and firms respond by hiring more workers and expanding businesses, and employment levels go up in the economy. That causes national income to go up as well. And as unemployment goes down, so does poverty. So you need to ultimately transition your chain of analysis to the fact that you need to say that it is going to reduce your poverty levels in the economy. So poverty levels would go down. And remember that whenever you're talking about poverty, make sure that you give reference. At first, you talk about the fact that absolute poverty will go down, right? Absolute poverty would go down because now people will be able to afford more basic necessities. Because definitely when incomes are rising, people will be able to afford basic necessities, right? So a lot of poor people who were maybe jobless might now be hired on as contractual part-time workers, maybe on an hourly basis or on an output basis, whatever it is. But they would start earning incomes, and they would then spend. They would buy goods and services that they weren't able to buy before, and that is going to result into a reduction in absolute poverty basically. You could also say that relative poverty might go down as well, because when poverty in general goes down, the gap between the rich and the poor goes down. Because although you could say that maybe this economic growth, if you're saying that this economic growth is more balanced and inclusive, what if this economic growth is more balanced and it is more inclusive? And in that sense, if you say that economic growth is more balanced and inclusive, it means that it is coming from all the different sectors in the economy. It's not that economic growth is coming from one dominant sector. Maybe the economic growth, so the benefit in this case, the benefit of economic growth is more equally distributed in the economy. So if you say that the benefit of economic growth or the increase in incomes is equally distributed in the economy, if you make that assumption, you need to make that assumption first. So if you make that assumption in the exam that this economic growth is benefiting the rich and the poor both, then definitely it's not that it's benefiting the rich only. It's not that this economic growth is coming from or benefiting only one prominent or dominant sector in the economy. Maybe it's not only benefiting the rich entrepreneurs, but it's also benefiting the middle class or the working class, or maybe people on lower income groups as well. And they are also equally contributing to the economic growth in the economy, and earning incomes in return for that. So relative poverty, in that sense, relative poverty would go down as well. So you can't really just say that relative poverty would go down. You need to explain the chain of analysis for that I just explained it right now. For that, so you could talk about, and this would happen when your economic growth is more balanced and inclusive, right? So unemployment levels in that case would go down. You could also say that maybe that as the interest rate goes down, so the people who were who had borrowed house loans, mortgages, and these mortgages were variable. Now mortgages are basically interest on house loans. So mortgages are basically interest. They are the interest paid on house loans. So if the poor people had borrowed money from banks to finance their housing, so that they could have a small place to maybe to live in, then in that case, if assuming that these mortgage rates are variable in nature, and if interest rate goes down, now the poor people will have more money in their hands, since they will be now paying lower interest rates. So it will help the poor in that sense, right? Some mortgage terms and conditions are such that they apply on variable interest rates, right? So now the poor will have more money in their hands, and they could spend on other basic necessities. Let's say more food, more better clothing, better living standards, consumer expenditure, maybe affording a good education for their children. So the living standards would go up, and again it would reduce poverty levels in the economy, right? Maybe the poor, because like I said, the poor would have more money to spend on basic necessities, right? They could improve their skills, spend on children's education, and that would result in, firstly, it would result in absolute poverty, and it would also result in relative poverty. Now, why am I saying it would result in relative poverty? It would result in relative poverty because here you are saying that the poor are spending. So remember that whenever the living standard of the poor goes up, remember that whenever the living standard of the poor goes up, the relative poverty goes down. Now, a major mistake when I was checking the answers of different students, and while going through the exam reports as well, and because I am also on a discussion group with the different examiners and different teachers from all over the world, and usually we discuss about the main problems that arises while answering questions. So in that sense, what there's a common consensus among all the teachers around the globe, that whenever students usually talk about poverty, they don't give references to absolute and relative poverty. They don't mention what type of poverty is going down. And the similar consensus is also there when we talk about the fact that students mishandle questions like unemployment. So if the question is saying how something is going to, so for example, if this question would have come, how increase in government spending reduces unemployment, or maybe how cut in interest rates reduces unemployment, maybe, right? So students will never maybe talk about the type of unemployment that will go down. They will talk about, okay, unemployment would go down, but what type of unemployment, whether you're talking about structural unemployment, cyclical or frictional. Also, if the question comes on taxation, they don't make a distinction between progressive, regressive taxes, direct, indirect taxes. So, and if the question comes on inflation, again, the examiners are of a general consensus, and the different teachers around the globe are of a general consensus. And these kind of discussions, healthy discussions, we keep on having, and we sort of share the answers as well with each other, where we sort of try to maybe mark and ask each other that what sort of mark would you give on this. So these healthy discussions among teachers also results into a better understanding of how different students are performing all around the globe. And you know I have come to the conclusion to realize that there's one thing that is lacking among all students, is that the chain of analysis or the in-depth information while writing answers is lacking. There's no other thing that I'm going to say, that yes, this is a major issue in economics. So also, like, for example, if the question is on inflation, generally students would talk about, okay, fine, maybe a cut in interest rates would maybe reduce inflation. But then inflation is also of two types. A cut in interest rate would reduce demand per inflation, not cost push. So you need to mention the type that you're targeting. Firstly, you mention in generally what happens, and then you focus on the types. Then you could also say that maybe for example, since the interest rates are going down, and it will probably it will enable people on low income groups who wanted to start up their own business. They will have now finance available. They could easily obtain loans for financing their startups, and that would result into more small entrepreneurs, encouraging and startup culture, encouraging enterprise, the factor of production, enterprise in the economy. And if enterprise goes up, your quantity of the FOP goes up, and that causes a shift in the productive capacity, the productive potential in the economy, causing long run economic growth, causing potential growth in the economy, where your full employment level of output goes up. And ultimately what's going to happen is that when the potential in the economy goes up, it allows firms to enhance their capacity building, where they could have the capacity to hire more workers and reduce unemployment in future as well, which would further be a contributing factor to reduce poverty levels in society. right? So, and again, when people encourage, when enterprise goes up, so does business profits goes up, so does the fact that because these enterprises will not be run by single people, they will be run by hiring more workers, right? So again, unemployment levels would go up, right? So and you could also I think that this is more than enough that you could speak on how a cut in interest rates could reduce poverty. Always remember that for 6 markers in P2, the analyze is focusing on the chain of analysis. So for here, the examiners are focusing on how you connect the dots, how one thing results into leads to another, how one event leads to another. So the chain of events has to be there, because analysis is about in-depth information, number two, diagrams, examples, and then the chain of analysis. These four things comprise of analysis, right? In-depth information, in-depth explanation that is presented in a logical, coherent manner with examples and diagrams, and then the chain of analysis, which means how one event is connecting to the other event, or it leads to the other event. Okay, now moving on to part D of the question, it says discuss, which is a command word, whether or not government intervention will correct market failure that is caused by a demerit good. Now, remember that 8 marker questions requires you to evaluate and critically, critique on the narrative that, for example, if you're saying that government intervention will correct the market failure, then you need to critique this narrative that no, it will not, or it will not correct the market failure if, these situations are present. So first of all, always I say to my kids that, the way you should start an 8 marker is that you should define the subject matter of the question. The subject matter of the question is that, it's asking about how could government correct a market failure. So you could start off by defining what a market failure is. You could also start off by defining what a demerit good is. But I would start off by defining that market failure is when how there's inefficient resource allocation that results into undesirable outcomes in society. And one of the examples of market failure is the overproduction and consumption of demerit goods that becomes maybe large enough that it requires or it necessitates government intervention. So this is how you could start off an answer, and the government could, come up with different ways in order to address this market failure. So, the first 2-3 lines could include this sort of a content, and then you could talk about the fact that how. So because this is the government intervention question, but government intervention is basically a solution to the problem. So first address the problem. First tell the examiner that how is market failure caused by demerit goods. So you talk about the fact that because you need to address the problem first, and then transition your answer to the how government intervention will resolve that problem. So we know that demerit goods are those goods that produce negative externalities, and we know that demerit goods are overconsumed and overproduced in free markets because consumers act irrationally. And firstly, the point is that because of information failure, they don't really perceive how harmful demerit goods are. So demerit goods are those goods that are perceived by consumers as being less harmful than they actually are. They don't really, because of lack of information and the information failure and the misinformation out there, or the lack of information or the incomplete information out there, consumers are not really aware to what extent those demerit goods could be harmful for them, and they consume them based on their own perceived benefits and costs related to those demerit goods, while the social costs and benefits of consuming demerit goods are much higher. The social cost of consuming demerit goods is much higher than the private cost of consumption, because although the private cost of consuming demerit goods would involve the harm that is caused to that individual person consuming those demerit goods, and that too he would perceive them to be less, but even to himself, those private costs would be significantly higher than what he perceives it to be, right? And since he perceives those private costs to be quite less, he would definitely consume them. He would overconsume those demerit goods, although then that would definitely damage him more, resulting into his health concerns and all of that. So consuming those demerit goods would also cause negative externalities or negative spillover effects to third parties. And one of the examples that you could give is that demerit goods, so demerit goods are not only cigarettes and alcohol. Another example of demerit goods is high sugar food, or unhealthy food, or high sugary drinks. All of this also results into high cholesterol problems, diabetes, health, lungs and heart problems, respiratory problems, and that causes the productivity of workers to go down at work, which causes the businesses to suffer as well, because lack of labor productivity would impact the businesses. Why are businesses suffering? Because of unhealthy eating patterns of the individual people in business, right, of workers. So there's something wrong in their eating behavior that is causing the businesses to suffer in terms of low incomes, low sales, and low profits. And that is all linked to how demerit goods causes a spillover effect on society. And another example that is much commonly used is about drug abuse and alcoholism and cigarettes consumption and all of that. So this does have an impact on people around you, such as passive smoking. It has an impact. It has a negative welfare effect on society basically, and that is why the government intervenes. And because of the presence of externalities, the social cost is more than the private cost of consumption. And you could say that the marginal social cost is more than the marginal private benefit for consumption, which simply means the marginal social cost means that the social cost of consuming each additional unit. Marginal means extra. So the additional cost of consuming, the additional social cost of consuming an additional unit of a demerit good is more than the additional private cost of consuming an additional, unit of a demerit good. And this difference represents the difference between the marginal social cost minus the marginal private cost is your externality, that the negative externality or the negative spillover effects that arises because of consuming an extra demerit good. And because you consume an extra demerit good, you want to consume that extra demerit good, that demand is out there in the market, and the producers then produce it. And that is why we say that demerit goods are always overproduced and overconsumed beyond socially optimum levels in society, and that is why that necessitates government intervention, right? So you could briefly explain all this. I explained in a lot of detail, but you could go a little bit brief on this, at least give the examiner the idea that So you could then move on by saying that government intervention would correct market failure, because the government could intervene in different ways. For example, it could impose indirect taxes, and imposing indirect taxes would basically increase the cost of production for firms, and increasing cost of, and then the firms would transfer that indirect, transfer that cost on consumers, which would also reduce, which would increase the price. They would transfer that burden, the tax burden on consumers, which would drive up the price of the product, and driving up the prices of the product would reduce the consumption as well. So basically the way indirect tax works is that, let's say that this is demand and this is supply, and let's say that Q1 quantities of demerit goods are consumed, and we are saying that this is way beyond socially optimum levels, and at this level the market is failing. So at Q1 the market failure arises. At Q1 the markets are failing and it's overconsumed and overproduced, right? So imposing an indirect tax would reduce your supply curve. It would shift the supply curve inwards, which would drive up the cost of production for firms, and firms would then transfer that cost on consumers, depending upon the elasticity of demand for the product. But right now, when we are going in favor of the narrative, we're going in favor of the fact that we're saying that indirect taxes would reduce the consumption and production of demerit goods. We're not right now, we're not going to mention elasticity. We will mention elasticity in evaluation. So you say that drives up the price of the product. The price of the product goes up. The price of demerit goods goes up, and that also results into a reduction in, not only a reduction, a shift in supply causes a reduction in production, and a contraction in demand causes a reduction in consumption. So the production and consumption both falls to Q2 from Q1. So all of the overproduction is now gone, and now the production and consumption falls to Q2, and we're going to assume here that Q2 is the socially optimum level. So this is a diagram that would work in your answer, that we're assuming that socially optimum level of production and consumption is achieved, and hence the market failure has, so mention the fact that the market failure has been corrected because of indirect taxes, via an increase in price and a reduction in output, causing a contraction in consumption as well. And basically this is one way in which government intervention could reduce, indirect taxes could reduce your production and consumption of demerit goods. Another way is because of providing more information. It's called information provision. And when the government provides more information provision through advertising, public awareness programs, and that is basically done in order to address the demand for the demerit goods. So here we basically, indirect taxes was aimed at reducing production, while and indirectly that causes the prices to rise, and that causes a reduction in consumption as well. But information, when you're working on providing information, healthy, desirable information that consumers need to know so that they change the perception about demerit goods, to make them realize that they're really harmful for them than they would actually think they are. That is aimed at reducing the demand for demerit goods, right? Because if you reduce the demand for demerit goods, demand would be registered in the market, and the firms would automatically do not produce them. They would produce less of it. So if the demand for these demerit goods goes down, so does the production of these demerit goods go down, and you see that there's a contraction in supply by a downward. So this contraction in supply, and then you say that now Q2 is your socially optimum level, and the price of demerit goods goes down as well because they get cheaper, because obviously the demand has gone down, and that reduces consumption and production. So you could say that it makes people more aware. The right information is given by the government through awareness programs, public awareness programs, and advertisements, and that addresses the market failure of overconsumption and overproduction of demerit goods. Right? You could also say that maybe if these demerit goods, another way in which the government could intervene by reducing production and consumption of demerit goods, as some demerit goods are also imported, right? Maybe certain unhealthy goods and services might be imported, and that is causing the consumption of demerit goods. Maybe the raw material for that demerit goods production is imported, so the government could restrict that as well. Maybe look at the import side, that maybe some of the demerit goods are imported, so maybe banning those imports, maybe imposing quotas on it, maybe imposing tariffs on it, could reduce the size of those imports for demerit goods, and then hence reduce the consumption of demerit goods since they were overconsumed. So that is again another way a government could intervene. Another way that the government could intervene is by imposing minimum prices. You could also talk about price controls, where you say that the government imposes minimum prices, where let's say this is demand for demerit good to supply of demerit good, and let's say this is the equilibrium price, and you say that at this price Q1 is consumed, and that is maybe this price is quite low, which is causing a lot of overconsumption. So maybe imposing a price control for P2 this would be effective, because it would do wonders by restricting demand to only Q2. Although I mean, it would increase the supply of demerit goods to Q3, but still only Q2 will be consumed, because that is a demand. So all of this would also result into surplus output, but let's not go into that area, that what should be done with that surplus output, because irrespectively the consumption is going down to Q2, right? Because consumers' demand is going down, so that reduces the consumption of demerit goods, right? So basically, so this is another way in which the government could deal with the problem of negative externalities or negative spillover effects caused by demerit goods, and the market failure that is caused by these. So all of these 3 to 4 ways of government intervention, you could address them in your answer and make these diagrams to sort of give you a competitive edge over other candidates in the exam. However, since it's a discuss question, you need to give the other side of the spectrum and give a critical narrative that criticize the narrative that not all government intervention might be successful. Although yes, government intervention is successful, but to an extent only. Not all government intervention is successful, because you could say that the demand for many demerit goods is inelastic, right? You could make that evaluation, because for example, for demand for cigarettes and alcohol, these are addictive goods, and if goods are addictive, their PET is inelastic, less than 1. And irrespective of the price rise, because remember we said that when the government imposes taxes, it causes prices to go up and it causes a contraction. But then you could make this diagram by saying that, look at this, if we make the demand curve inelastic, let's say, and if in that sense you reduce your supply because of an indirect tax, what's happening is that initially Q1 was being produced and consumed, and now the quantity goes down to Q2, but despite the fact that the price went up significantly from P1 to P2, you could see this difference. You could see this extent to which the price has gone up. But if you look at the extent to which the quantity has gone down, look at this difference. I mean, the reduction in quantity is quite insignificant. So in that sense, you could say that indirect tax has not been a very successful, although it has been successful in reducing to an extent, but not a very successful measure. You can't rely on indirect taxes to solely reduce market failure or eliminate market failure in that sense, because the demand for a lot of addictive goods might be inelastic, right? Demerit goods might be inelastic. Maybe the government, and in that sense, if it's not achieving its intended aims, there's a word that you can use. It's known as government failure. Government failure means when the government policy is failing to achieve its desired objectives. And government failure would also occur. Maybe one of the reasons in which the government failure could occur is maybe the right amount of intervention did not take place. Maybe the right amount of public awareness programs did not take place. Maybe the government didn't end up really spending a lot on advertising and public awareness campaigns. Maybe the size of the indirect tax was wrongly imposed, right? Maybe price controls, maybe the minimum price was, let's say, instead of imposing the minimum price way above equilibrium, only the minimum price, maybe the government imposed a minimum price which was slightly above the original equilibrium price. So imposing a minimum price slightly above the original equilibrium price is, although government intervention, and on the books, on the paper, it is that the government is intervening, but consumers don't really feel that price increase. They don't feel that burden of the price increase. So consumption in that sense will not reduce to a significant extent. It would just reduce insignificantly, or maybe not reduce at all. Right? So this is the language that you need to use while evaluating answers. Also remember that what if the government imposes a minimum price below the equilibrium? Always remember that a minimum price is a price control that should be imposed above the equilibrium. If you're imposing a minimum price below the equilibrium, then it will be ineffective. Remember that minimum price imposed below the equilibrium is ineffective, and in that case, the original free market quantity and the free market price will prevail. So Q1 will prevail at a price of P1 if you're imposing a minimum price below the equilibrium. It will not be effective. So whatever quantity was being sold at the free market price and at the free market quantity in the price will be sold, despite the fact that a minimum price is imposed. But you impose a minimum price below the equilibrium, right? That's the problem. It should have been imposed above it, right? So this would result into government failure. Also, you could say that a minimum price causes, although you could say that a minimum price, although might be successful in reducing the consumption to Q2, but it would cause another problem for the government. It would cause some unintended consequences. Unintended consequences means consequences that were not intended by the government. I mean, they were not foreseen, maybe. It would result into a surplus production of demerit goods, and the government then might need to buy those demerit goods and maybe export that surplus, or maybe burn that surplus. Especially, usually it's a demerit good, so the government might burn that surplus. It's resulting into wasteful, inefficient resource allocation, because although you're trying to address market failure by making resource allocation more efficient through imposing price control so that the consumption goes down, but then you're causing another market failure by causing an inefficient or a misallocation of resource, because now you're creating a surplus of demerit goods, and you need to do something about a surplus. Maybe if the government buys that surplus and it burns it, it's wasting. The government is wasting the resources, right? That money could have been spent on education and healthcare, right? So the fact that, and also that, at times, even if you make these demerit goods expensive through price controls and maybe through indirect taxes, maybe some consumers are quite rich that they don't really. If your consumers are quite rich, then they might not feel that burden of a higher price. They might still buy it, right? So the rich people might not really be affected or disincentivized because of a higher price being charged on demerit goods and high duties being imposed. So you could say that. So this is how and what you need to evaluate, and maybe some form of government intervention is also undesirable. For example, indirect taxes, we know, are inflationary in nature. They increase the cost of production, and that has a cost push inflationary effects in the economy. And also, indirect taxes are regressive in nature as well. So they result into income inequality. So income inequality is also a market failure. So on one end, you're trying to reduce a market failure by reducing the market failure for demerit goods. But on the other hand, the trade-off is, or the opportunity cost is, that you're creating another market failure, that is income inequality. And if heavy indirect taxes were imposed, then the size of the income inequality may just worsen itself. So these are the things that you need to, and also maybe if the government is coming up with public awareness campaigns, then these public awareness campaigns they might not be effective in the short run. They might not be effective immediately. There might be a time lag, because it will take time for people to realize that these demerit goods are harmful for them, and they need to reduce their consumption. So in the short run, maybe it might not really work, and the government will feel that, the government might feel that it's not working, and they might stop this. And although the government should have waited, and because the government, and especially for governments that are sitting with limited funds, they might not have the resources to spend a lot on advertising campaigns and public awareness campaigns. So market failure might still persist there, and instead of being corrected, it might not be corrected. But the question is discuss whether or not government intervention will correct the market failure. So you say that, if such circumstances persist or exist in an economy, especially for poor countries where governments lack finances available, because then this sort of a problem might persist. Also, even if the government does somehow manages to spend its allocated expenditure on these public awareness campaigns, then then the government might increase taxes in future in order to fund this, in order to fund the spending, and increasing taxes on future might again harm the poor. Or maybe, you know the government might cut down expenditures from other areas to finance this. Maybe it might cut down expenditures from other areas such as education, healthcare, which is quite essential. Maybe it cuts down expenditures on essential public services, right? Or maybe so the government, so as an economic student, you need to think on those lines. And the more depth you go into in an exam, given the time that you have, keeping in view the time that you have, then the more impressed this examiner is. And you could conclude this answer by saying that, government intervention, although is successful, but some government intervention, or it depends upon, maybe some government intervention might be ineffective, and such as the wrong level of tax imposed, the wrong level of price controls imposed. In that sense, it would not correct the market failure. Maybe it would worsen the market failure in some circumstances, causing unintended consequences and government failure as a result. So the government must, rationally decide what sort of government intervention it is imposing and how should it impose, and it should be properly executed with a plan. This is how you can end your answer. So that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you all around in the next video. Until then, take care.